The city buzzed with its usual energy as the morning sun pierced through the clouds, painting the streets with golden hues. The bus stop on Main Avenue was crowded, filled with people clutching their coffee cups and bags, each immersed in their thoughts. Among them stood Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a worn leather jacket and jeans. His unassuming presence blended him into the crowd, unnoticed by the hurried commuters. As the bus arrived with a screech and hiss, people boarded in a rush. Keanu chose a seat near the middle, quietly observing the scene around him. The passengers were a mix of tired office workers, students scrolling on their phones, and an elderly man struggling to find his balance as he boarded. He held a cane in one hand and a paper bag in the other, his frail body a stark contrast to the bustling energy around him. The elderly man shuffled down the aisle, searching for a seat as the bus lurched forward. Most passengers avoided his gaze, too absorbed in their phones or conversations. A few glanced at him briefly before turning away. The only open spot was next to a sharply dressed man in his mid-30s, engrossed in typing furiously on his laptop. The elderly man hesitated before approaching. "Excuse me," the man said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "May I sit here?" The businessman didn't look up. "The seat's taken," he muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the empty space beside him. The elderly man's expression faltered, his grip tightening on the cane as he looked around for another option. Keanu, observing the scene from a few rows back, leaned forward slightly. His calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside him. The bus jostled to a stop at a red light, and Keanu stood up, walking toward the front. "You can have my seat," Keanu said warmly, his voice cutting through the low chatter. The elderly man turned, gratitude flashing across his face. As he moved to take the offered seat, the businessman finally glanced up, his eyes narrowing at Keanu. "Why the dramatics?" the businessman sneered. If he needed help, he could have just asked louder. Keanu didn't flinch. "Sometimes people shouldn't have to ask twice," he replied evenly, his tone firm but composed. The tension in the bus was palpable as passengers began to look up. Their curiosity piqued. The bus resumed its journey, the atmosphere heavy with an awkward silence. Passengers who had been ignoring the elderly man now stole glances at him and Keanu. The elderly man settled into the seat with a quiet, "Thank you," his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his paper bag and cane. Keanu stood nearby, holding onto a rail, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to the businessman's visible irritation. The man shot Keanu a condescending look, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Playing hero, are we? That's cute." Keanu didn't react immediately. Instead, he surveyed the passengers. Many avoided eye contact, while others seemed to be silently rooting for him. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Kindness shouldn't be optional. It's just basic respect." The businessman scoffed. "Respect? Sure, but people need to help themselves. The world doesn't owe anyone anything." Keanu's gaze lingered on the man, unblinking. "Maybe the world doesn't owe us, but that doesn't mean we can't make it better. It's not about owing. It's about being human." A murmur rippled through the bus. A young woman near the front nodded subtly, while an older passenger adjusted her seat to face the unfolding exchange. The businessman shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the bus's collective attention. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the next stop. The elderly man fidgeted, clearly uneasy with the tension. Keanu noticed and leaned down slightly to him. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. The man smiled faintly, his lined face betraying years of weariness. "I'm fine, son. Thank you. Not many people step up these days." Keanu straightened, turning back to the businessman. "You see, it costs nothing to help, but it can mean everything to someone else." The businessman's jaw tightened. "Easy to say when you're just riding a bus, not running a business. Some of us have bigger things to worry about." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but piercing. "If your success comes at the cost of compassion, maybe you're not as successful as you think." The bus jolted to a stop again, the tension now thick enough to cut with a knife. The businessman looked as if he wanted to respond, but instead glanced out the window, his face a mixture of annoyance and unease. The bus carried on, but the atmosphere was far from ordinary. Keanu remained standing near the elderly man, his calm presence serving as a quiet shield. The businessman, now visibly flustered, adjusted his laptop bag, and muttered under his breath, though loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is why people don't get ahead, wasting time on pointless drama." A young woman sitting a few rows back spoke up unexpectedly. "Respect isn't pointless," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Maybe if more people practiced it, we wouldn't have to talk about it so much." The businessman turned sharply toward her. "And what would you know about success? Let me guess, still figuring out your life?" She didn't flinch. "Success isn't just about money or status. It's about how you treat people." Several heads nodded in agreement. A man near the back chimed in. "Yeah, and sometimes it takes someone like him," he gestured toward Keanu, "to remind us what really matters." The businessman looked around, realizing he was outnumbered. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "Everyone's a philosopher today." Keanu, still calm, finally broke his silence. "You know," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "I've met a lot of people in my life, some with power, wealth, and status, and others with none of those things. But do you know what they all remember? How they were treated." His words hung in the air, resonating with the passengers. The elderly man, now more relaxed, smiled faintly and added, "He's right. You can have everything in the world, but if you don't have decency, what's the point?" The businessman opened his mouth as if to retort, but stopped himself. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, from anger to discomfort. He glanced out the window again, avoiding the stares of the passengers who had clearly taken Keanu's side. The bus stopped again, and an older woman boarded, clutching a heavy grocery bag. Without hesitation, a teenage boy stood up and offered his seat. The woman thanked him warmly, and the boy shrugged modestly, muttering, "It's no big deal." Keanu smiled, catching the boy's eye and nodding in approval. The ripple effect of his actions was already spreading. The businessman noticed the exchange, his lips tightening. He shifted in his seat, looking as if he wanted to disappear into the upholstery. The bus rolled along, quieter now, though the tension still lingered. The businessman sat stiffly, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. His gaze occasionally darted to Keanu, who remained standing calmly by the elderly man. Around them, the mood on the bus had noticeably shifted. Passengers exchanged small smiles, and a few even struck up quiet conversations, a stark contrast to the earlier indifference. Keanu finally spoke again, this time addressing no one in particular. "It's funny how a small act can change everything. A kind word, a seat offered. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn someone's day around." The young woman who had spoken earlier nodded. "It's true, and you never know who might really need it." The businessman exhaled sharply, drawing the attention of those nearby. "Look," he said, his tone softer but still defensive, "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I just don't see the point in making a big deal out of this." Keanu turned to him, his expression patient. "It's not about making a big deal. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching, or when they are." His gaze was steady, but there was no hostility, only sincerity. "We're all in this together, whether we realize it or not." The businessman hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. He glanced at the elderly man, who met his gaze with a calm, forgiving smile. The businessman shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "Maybe I was too harsh." "I didn't mean anything by it." The elderly man chuckled softly. "Apology accepted, son. And for what it's worth, we all have bad days." The businessman seemed surprised by the response, his defensive posture easing. For a moment he looked younger, less hardened. He nodded curtly as if to himself, and returned his attention to his laptop, though he no longer seemed as absorbed in it. As the bus approached its final stop, the businessman stood, adjusting his bag. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to the elderly man. "Here," he said awkwardly, holding out a business card. "If you ever need help, financial advice or something, give me a call." The elderly man blinked in surprise, then smiled warmly. "Thank you, son. That's very kind." The businessman nodded stiffly, his gaze flickering to Keanu before he stepped off the bus. He walked away quickly, his expression thoughtful, as if replaying the events in his mind. Keanu returned to his seat for the last stretch of the ride. The elderly man turned to him, his voice low but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for stepping in. You didn't have to, but you did." Keanu smiled gently. Sometimes all it takes is one small act to remind people what matters. The bus came to its final stop, and as the passengers disembarked, many cast appreciative glances at Keanu. Some offered quiet thank yous, while others simply smiled, their spirits visibly lifted. Keanu helped the elderly man down the steps and onto the sidewalk, ensuring he was steady on his feet. "Take care," he said warmly, giving the man a reassuring pat on the shoulder. The elderly man nodded, his eyes twinkling. "You too, son. Keep doing what you're doing. It makes a difference." As the bus pulled away, Keanu stood quietly on the sidewalk, watching the city bustle around him. He smiled faintly, knowing that, for at least a moment, he had made the world a little kinder. As Keanu walked away from the bus stop, he blended seamlessly into the crowd, his modest attire and quiet demeanor making him just another face in the bustling city. Yet, the impact of his actions lingered long after he disappeared from view. Back on the bus, the young woman who had defended the elderly man struck up a conversation with the teenager who had offered his seat. They talked about how simple gestures could inspire others. "It's like a chain reaction," she said, smiling. "One person stands up, and suddenly everyone remembers they can make a difference too." The elderly man, now sitting alone but feeling uplifted, looked at the business card in his hand. He didn't know if he'd ever call the number, but the gesture had softened the earlier harshness of the interaction. It reminded him that even those who seem indifferent can be reached. Meanwhile, the businessman found himself replaying the encounter in his mind as he walked to his office. He had always prided himself on being efficient, direct, and goal-oriented. Yet, something about the quiet confidence and unwavering kindness of the man on the bus unsettled him. For the first time in years, he questioned his priorities. By the time he reached his office, he had made a decision. He opened his email and drafted a message to his team, proposing a new initiative to support elderly individuals in the community. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step, a small act inspired by a chance encounter. The morning after the bus incident, Keanu found himself walking along the city streets with a cup of coffee in hand. The hustle and bustle of daily life surrounded him, yet he remained present, noticing the small, beautiful moments so often overlooked. A street musician strummed a soft tune on his guitar, his hat collecting a few coins from generous passers-by. A child laughed joyfully as their mother swung them by the arms, their shared happiness lighting up the dreary street. Keanu paused at a crosswalk, observing a delivery worker struggling with a heavy box. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, steadying the box and helping guide the worker safely across. "Thanks, man," the worker said, flashing a grateful smile. Keanu nodded, replying simply, "Anytime." Later that week, as he sipped coffee at a small, cozy cafe tucked away from the city's noise, a notification pinged on his phone. An article was making waves online. "Businessman launches initiative inspired by a bus encounter." Curious, Keanu clicked on the link. The story described a previously unknown businessman who had begun a program to assist elderly residents in the community, inspired by a moment of self-reflection during a bus ride. Keanu read the article with quiet satisfaction. The businessman's name wasn't mentioned, but the description of the event left no doubt in Keanu's mind. It was the same man from the bus. The story had already begun to spread, with commenters sharing their own acts of kindness inspired by the article. As he finished reading, Keanu looked up to see a familiar figure outside the cafe window. It was the elderly man from the bus, walking slowly but steadily along the street. Their eyes met through the glass, and the man stopped, offering a small wave and a warm smile. Keanu smiled back, rising from his seat and stepping outside. "You're looking well," Keanu said, his tone genuinely pleased. "Thanks to you," the man replied. "You reminded me there are still good people out there." The two shared a brief but meaningful conversation, reflecting on how that day on the bus had left a lasting impression on them both. When the man departed, Keanu stood for a moment, watching him disappear into the crowd. The world seemed just a little brighter. The days turned into weeks, and the story of the businessman's initiative continued to circulate online. Local news outlets picked it up, inspiring similar efforts in nearby communities. People began to share their own stories of stepping out of their routines to lend a hand, a neighbor helping an elderly woman carry groceries, a stranger paying for someone's meal, or a child giving their allowance to someone in need. Keanu observed these changes with quiet pride. He had never sought attention or credit, but seeing the growing wave of compassion gave him hope. On one particularly sunny morning, he received an unexpected call from a local journalist who had connected the dots and wanted to interview him about the bus incident. "I appreciate the interest," Keanu said with his characteristic modesty, "but I think the focus should stay on the kindness people are showing, not me." The journalist respected his wishes but left the conversation inspired. The next article she wrote focused on the importance of small actions, calling it the ripple effect of kindness. Though it didn't name Keanu, the message resonated far and wide, sparking discussions in schools, workplaces, and community groups. One afternoon, as Keanu strolled through a park, he noticed a group of kids setting up a helping station. They offered water bottles and snacks to joggers and walkers, along with handwritten notes saying, "You're doing great," and "Keep smiling." He stopped to thank them for their efforts. "We read about that story online," one of the kids said, beaming. "It made us want to help too." Keanu crouched to their level, smiling warmly. "You're already making a big difference. Keep it up." As he walked away, the sound of their laughter echoed behind him. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt that the world's potential for kindness outweighed its flaws. Months later, the ripple effects of that single bus ride had reached places Keanu could never have imagined. Community centers reported a rise in volunteer sign-ups, while local businesses adopted kindness initiatives, offering discounts to those who performed good deeds. The original businessman who had sparked these changes quietly expanded his program, turning it into a non-profit that provided transportation and resources for elderly citizens. One crisp autumn evening, Keanu attended a small charity event supporting this new non-profit. The room was filled with a mix of people: community leaders, volunteers, and those who had benefited directly from the program. Keanu remained in the background, his presence understated as always. He watched as people shared stories about how the program had changed their lives. An older woman approached him, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I don't know if you were involved in starting all of this," she began, "but whoever did, it's made such a difference. My father hasn't stopped talking about how much easier his life has become." Keanu smiled gently. "It's amazing what a little kindness can do." As the night wore on, he quietly slipped out, leaving the event as unassumingly as he had entered. The stars shone brightly above as he walked through the city streets, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a single act. Back home, Keanu sat by his window, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars. He thought about the countless lives touched by the chain of events that day on the bus. The businessman's actions, the journalist's article, the kids in the park, all of it stemmed from a moment of standing up for what was right. He picked up a journal he kept for quiet moments like this and wrote a single line. Sometimes it just takes one spark to light the way for others. Closing the journal, he leaned back in his chair, content. While the world wasn't perfect, it was better than it had been yesterday, and that was enough.